I talk to you as someone who photographs and films for more than 4 decades. I'm immensely grateful for this technology that allowed me to record so many valuable memories. And up to this day, my coaching is heavily informed by my video notes. Hello! Today at the Climbing Talent Development Show, I want to help you to record better video of yourself or your athletes. Regardless if you film with your smartphone or with the full-on system camera, it can't hurt to better understand the possibilities and limitations of your equipment. This video is a free addition to my climbing performance coaching series, particularly to the Climbing Coach's Eye installment that talks about best practices of what to do with your recorded footage. It's all about developing your coach's eye. Video can help you at any step of your coaching. For example, for augmented feedback and movement analysis, but also in quite surprising ways. More about that in the Climbing Coach's Eye installment. I've been taking pictures already back in the film days when you needed a basic understanding to not be totally frustrated after developing the film. A lot of what we know about movement and locomotion comes from the film era. Then came video. You could record on tape, rewind it and show it on a monitor for much faster feedback than in the film days. Unfortunately, the video of the 80s and 90s had much poorer resolution than even this 8mm film, and true slow motion was not possible. So just the faster turnaround was really a true advantage in a coaching setting. Nowadays, digital recording potentially gives us instant feedback, but from my experience that doesn't necessarily lead to better results. Maybe people nowadays trust technology a bit too much and somehow assume that the camera knows best what's best for you. Spoiler, it doesn't. Most footage I see by climbing coaches, parents or athletes would be vastly more informative and useful with just a basic understanding of their device's settings. So, without further ado, let's look into best practices for recording video for climbing coaches, parents and self-coach climbers. Let's start with the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is a fundamental concept in photography. It originates from film photography, but applies to digital photography as much as it does to shooting video. It's like the holy trinity of photography. Nothing is beyond it. The exposure triangle consists of 3 key variables: aperture, shutter speed and ISO. ISO refers to a camera's sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO, the brighter the photo. In this video, I only consider sensor size for sensitivity to light, as larger sensors are more sensitive to light. If a sensor is twice the size, it can collect twice the light, if it's of the same age, of the same generation. Camera quality is the latest smartphone arms race, and one of the biggest contributors to great looking pictures is the camera sensor. Most smartphone sensors typically measure just about 1 centimeter across. By comparison, the sensors of system cameras are at least 4 or 5 times the size. Now, aperture refers to the size of the aperture hole in the lens. The larger the hole, the brighter the photo. For our purpose, only when you choose a new camera or lens, aperture is a consideration. So I don't talk about it much in this video. Shutter speed, though, refers to the length of time the sensor is exposed to the outside world. The longer the shutter speed, the more light enters the sensor. Shutter speed is the most important factor of the exposure triangle, especially if you want to record slow motion footage, as I will explain later. Together, ISO, aperture and shutter speed determine the overall exposure of an image. Let's look into other considerations.
The obvious thing to record footage nowadays with, of course, are smartphones. They've gotten a lot better over the last years and have different lenses. I'll talk about this later. But they also have some shortcomings. Let's talk about their strong points. They're very convenient. You always have them with you. They are fantastic in giving quick feedback. Even more so when you use a tablet that share the same sensors with the smartphones. So first you might notice that this looks really bulky. It's I think a iPhone 11 Max, so it has a rather big screen, which is nice if you want to give quick feedback to the athlete, but it's also in a cage. It sits in the cage, and this is to attach it really quickly in all kinds of orientations on the tripod, or anything that stabilizes the footage. So this is already more stable than if I would hold it in my hand like this. And this is the first main point I want to talk about, is shaky footage. Okay, if it's something incredible that you recorded and it happens to be shaky, nobody cares, it's okay. But if you really want to make the best use of your recordings, it's somehow a pity. So it's really hard to analyze shaky handheld footage. Over the years, or almost decades, I was really happy with this kind of monopods. Now this is a Manfrotto monopod, and it has a fluid, I shouldn't say head, but an element, a fluid element that kind of dampens the movement. And this is really convenient if you're shooting lead or sport climbing and you need to move the camera to follow the climber. This is a really good way. What's also good about using a monopod compared to a tripod is that in most scenarios you won't be able to put up a tripod, but in training you definitely should. If you really want to learn something about your climbing, about the fine details of your movement, you almost need to have the camera in a locked position. It allows you to overlay footage and see the difference between attempts. And that leads me instantly to the next part. So what do you actually want to record? You know, ideally the climber is well within the view of the lens of the recording device, but the climber shouldn't be too small, because then the resolution will be not fantastic and it will be really hard for you to see like foot placements or details of handholds. So in an ideal world, you record like the climber plus half a meter, maximum 1 meter around him or her. And of course, that's sometimes tricky to do, and you need some anticipation. For example, with dynos or with dynamic movements of where he and she is flying to. It's a pity if you cut off part of the climber's limbs and then cannot see what she actually did at this moment. This consideration is true for any device you might record your footage with. If you buy a new smartphone, look for something that has a really short wide angle.
If you only film from behind the back of the climber and the hands are hidden, you learn very little from this footage. In this example, I started to shoot her from behind during her first attempts, and then I realized that this angle is really not so good, and then I moved around to her right side, and this is how I could record this really interesting footage, and especially this foot kick that enables the hand movement. And this wouldn't be visible from any other angle. So play around with the angles, but again, don't forget, not during the movement. You're not creating art here. It's really about getting a clean shot of the most interesting action. Climbing is not so easy to shoot video of because of the obstructions. If we can't see if it's how the hold and how the hand on the hold moves, then it's really difficult to say anything about and learn anything about this particular move, because if it's a jug, then totally different principles apply than if it's a sloping handhold or a crimper. Already makes a huge difference of how they affect the move. Try to get the best possible angle. Sometimes it might even be better to hang the camera somewhere. Many cameras manufacturers have a remote app where you can operate your camera with your phone. And I showed you at the beginning, I have all my cameras in these cages, and so I can even hang the camera. I can hang it on a bolt, I can hang it in a tree, and this allows me to have the camera in the most interesting positions.
One thing that is still really important and a limited factor is sensor size. Like, how big is the sensor in the camera that records the picture? This would be a big sensor. It would collect a lot of light, and this is a smaller sensor and it doesn't collect so much light. And this is true for smartphones, this is true for tablets, any tablets, and that's also true for most action cam. Smartphones and tablets, the classes would be very convenient, instant feedback, the footage goes instantly into your camera roll, or however your archive of pictures and videos on your phone. In most cases you have it linked to a cloud service, which is another important aspect to consider. And now, how do you archive your footage? Ideally, you want to be able to demonstrate your progress or the progress of a climber in a couple of years. It would be a pity if you run out of storage on your device and then you delete it all, and all this fantastic information is lost. So that's another thing to consider. Definitely a plus of the smart devices, of the smartphones. The biggest minus is the small sensor size.
Every coach that uses video is looking for the same thing: clear, slow motion video to observe their athletes' movements. In this example, we want to shed some light into the difference between her failed and her successful attempt. For slow motion, video needs to be recorded with a higher frame rate than it is played back with. However, if you don't control your recording device's settings, you might end up with blurred images, the dreaded motion blur.
And all your resolution and also your frame rate will be basically lost because of motion blur.
Reducing motion blur is about managing shutter speed, not frames per second. But most cameras, and especially smartphones, only allow you to control the frame rate, the FPS, the frames per second, and the resolution, not the shutter speed. The key to reducing motion blur is having enough light on the subject, which allows for a fast shutter speed. But you don't always get to control how much light there is in a given situation. So it helps to understand your options regarding the other parameters. With shutter speed, it is important to keep its relationship with frame rate, with frames per second that you record the video in mind. So an example would be you record a slow motion video with 250 frames per second. That would mean that in order to have a sharp image that lends itself well to analysis, would need a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. In many poorly lit indoor gyms, that's already pushing the limits of small sensors.
The poor camera, the sensor doesn't get enough light. Modern iPhones and I think most smartphones, the best compromise of a resolution and frame rate right now is 4K 60p. This is what you want to use. Remember, I mentioned that you won't get fantastic slow motion in a dim-lit Boulder gym, and there's a reason for that.
You won't have enough light to really afford a 1/500th of a second as the shutter speed. And this is why you might want to look into cameras with a bigger sensor.
The next step up in terms of what you can do would be 1-inch sensor. That's quite a bit bigger than smartphone sensor. And actually the best choice is, for a couple of reasons that I'm going to mention, is these Sony cameras. This is the RX100 Mark V. This is actually really a consideration. Let's talk about the drawbacks of investing in a camera. I think that's like 700 euros, so it's not cheap because of this bigger sensor mainly. Of course, it's really not as convenient for many reasons. First of all, it records to a SD card that you have to get out of the camera, and put into the computer and put it on the hard disk and so on. When we do camps or clinics, another drawback is also that the display is rather small. So nowadays the young athletes really expect something bigger for feedback, like the fat tablet. And also all of these cameras somehow have their own ways of how you go through the menu. So it's not something that you would put up for the athletes to look at and make them happy. No, this is not going to happen. Like choosing any kind of camera automatically means that you're cutting back on the feedback side of it. Unless you put up fix the camera to a computer and attach this to a huge screen and have basically somebody play the files for the athletes. Of course, that would be an ideal world, but that would mean that you would use somebody who only does this, some dedicated media person. Back to the sensor size. This is a 1-inch sensor, and actually I bought this camera because of its fantastic slow motion. And this camera has a really fast lens and a 1-inch sensor, and it has this slow motion mode of recording 250 frames per second in full HD. Do this even if your phone offers the slow motion of 250, what some do. If you're outdoors, that can work. Now, on a sunny day, really no problem. If you're indoors, forget it. So this scenario of recording, bouldering, or actually climbing in a dim light gym definitely is a reason to invest in a dedicated camera with a bigger sensor. Most action cams have basically the same sensor as most smartphones, with one exception. This is this Insta360R camera has a module that also has a 1-inch sensor. And if you want to record a lot of bouldering, tight indoor spaces that are not lit fantastically, this is really a consideration. This is the scenario of bouldering. How about sport climbing, heat climbing? If you're a coach or a parent who wants to get the best footage of that. First of all, in bouldering, you get away with framing your tablet or your phone just like this and leave it on a tripod. In many cases, this covers the whole boulder problem, and if you're recording with 4K, resolution will be big enough for you being able to analyze something in the video. In sport climbing, we're talking 12 meters, 15 meters, and if you put the camera in a locked position on a tripod like this, you have to put it somewhere where it overlooks the whole route, and then the climber will be too small for you to see any details. If this is your job, if you're a coach who coaches lead climbing, sport climbing, or if you're a parent who wants to get the best footage of the kids, you should consider to invest in a system camera. And they're called system cameras, I think, because of their exchangeable lenses. And this is the biggest plus of these cameras, is the exchangeable lenses. And in particular for lead and sport climbing, what you need is a telephoto lens. You don't get this in a smartphone, you don't get this in a tablet, and you don't get this in an action cam. They're all made for tight spaces, they're made for vlogging, for selfies, so they have nice wide angles, that's fantastic. But if you need some kind of reach, this is called reach, you have to have a telephoto lens. Now, many of the small cameras, like the Sony I showed you, have really long lenses, but then don't forget, if they have a small sensor, you gained reach, but you're still dealing with a lot of noise or motion blur. So these cameras have a lot bigger sensor than what's in a smartphone or even in the 1-inch cameras that I showed you. Also consider the frame rates that they offer. For example, this is a Lumix GH5. I like the Lumix system a lot because the lenses are really small, and so they're good for traveling. And that was the first camera that offered 4K 60p, the first affordable camera, of course. With this lens, sets you back of about 2,000 euros, so it's quite an investment. But I think it's totally worth it. This combination served me, I think I have this camera for 5 years now, and it served me really well. And what's really good about the GH5 is that the stabilization, the sensor stabilization and the in-lens stabilization work really well, and they work hand in hand. So that's fantastic, and you can get away with handheld shots that were impossible even a couple of years ago, 10 years ago. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have other questions concerning video recordings. Thank you very much for watching. Leave your comments below, subscribe to the channel, and see you soon with another installment of the Climbing Talent Development Show. Bye bye.